shipping is going to have to make choices in a way that it never has before. And the way that this becomes relevant to you saying, are we seeing changes? The number of leaders who are talking about purpose within an organization. This is kind of one of those woolly things is, it's a bit like CSR, let's leave it to the HR people and the women. This is not really very important. It's soft stuff for reports and PR agencies. No, wrong, reset. Because when you have to make these choices, which are not business choices, they are not about how much money you can make. Because if it's about where do you make money, it's very simple. We know how to do that. We've got all sorts of ways to evaluate how best to make money. When you have to make a choice which is moral or ethical, suddenly you need some kind of purpose because you need something to measure it against, which means companies have to start saying, this is our purpose. These are our values. And when it comes to these difficult choices, that gives you a framework within which you can make a legitimate choice. So that's why purpose is important.
Welcome to the Shipping Podcast, where I meet interesting maritime professionals sharing their passion for the shipping industry and their everyday job. I am your host. My name is Lena Gothberg. Hello, Shipping Podcast listeners, and welcome to episode 193 of the Shipping Podcast. She's back. Kate D Adamson is back on the Shipping Podcast. For those of you who haven't listened to all the previous episodes, which is probably only me and a handful of hardcore fans who have, in episode 35, released way back in June 2016, I had my first conversation with Kate. We met in London, and after that meeting, I re-evaluated the concept of my podcast. Everything she said made me rethink the entire idea of the maritime industry. So if you want to listen to our previous conversation with the usual background questions, just go back to episode 35 or use the search function on the website shippingpodcast.com. There are only 2 Kates on there. The other one is Captain Kate. So after that meeting, I stopped picking the low-hanging fruits of interviewing friends and colleagues and started to go for people who wanted to make a difference in this industry, which we love so much. As you know, I've been on a quest for the new normal, the things that will change when we come out of the pandemic, and I haven't seen it. Instead, I've seen the same old, same old. So when I discovered that Kate is now working on the ESG agenda, not only in maritime, I was happy that she agreed to come back on the podcast and share her views on the future. Before we start, if you haven't listened to Kate, she speaks fast, and you must concentrate on following her thoughts. We talked for so long that I realized it's too much to serve in one go. So here is the first of 2 episodes on ESG strategy. I hope you like it. It changes your view of the maritime world. Good to see you again.
And great to see you. It's been a long time.
It's been a long time. It's been a pandemic and it's been busy people and it's been you traveling the world and all of that. But it was 6 years ago.
Wow.
We made the first episode.
Wow. And that was one of the first ones, correct?
Well, it was number 35. So I think I had done all the low-hanging fruits, if you excuse my language. But
are you calling me low-hanging fruit? I think you just accused me of being low-hanging fruit there.
No. I think I had interviewed all the people I knew, so to say. The easy ones to reach. And then I met you. And I would say it changed my way of thinking.
Really?
So thank you for that, yes.
In what way did it change your way of thinking? This is fascinating.
It made me think outside the box. Yeah, I'm known for thinking outside the box, but you gave me a perspective of the shipping industry, which was different. It was more of outside in. And usually I was used to looking at things from the inside and out. And that gave me a new perspective. So thank you for that.
Well, it's a great pleasure, and it's an interesting thing that you bring up there, because people talk about shipping being insular, and I think it's something that all industries suffer from that, actually, and all organizations suffer from that. I think it's a natural thing. You get into an environment, you start using, 3-letter acronyms that everybody understands, within the industry, nobody else does. And there are certain things that, you just assume everybody knows. And I think one of the interesting parts of what's going on, in business now is this recognition that, that as Einstein said, you can't, solve the problems using the same thinking that created them. And a lot of that is perspective. It's about reframing, as you know, which is what, one of the things that I talk about. You need to reframe, the way that you think about not just problems, but about everything. And that shift of perspective from we are in the shipping industry looking out to let's step outside and look in here. That's an interesting way to change your perspective.
And now after 6 years, I need to reframe again. So that's why you're here. So Kate D Adamson, what is the D in there, Kate D Adamson?
The D actually stands for Dawn. And I was named for my very dear aunt, Auntie Dawn, Dawny baby, as she's known. And she married into the family the year that I was born. So I was named Catherine Dawn after Dawny. So yes, and she's very, very special to me. So yeah, that's the D is for Dawn.
And what is a blue futurist? Let's recap.
In the UK, I'm not sure how well it's known around the world, but blue tends to be, an epithet for someone who uses bad language, which of course I do. But that's not why I was known as a blue futurist. I think it's a term that, because I was so involved in blue economy, and maritime and shipping, sort of blue futures was something that came up. But actually, blue economy, maritime is actually a comparatively small part of what I do. But I'm very much known within shipping and maritime because there aren't, an awful lot of people who are focusing on, on the blue economy as futurists quite yet. So I think that's why I'm kind of known for that. I mean, I am a futurist in the respect that I make my living trying to understand what's coming next, and also increasingly helping people to understand that there are choices about what comes next, because an awful lot of futurists are really talking about technology, and I think that is a symptom of the fact that for the last sort of 50 years, really, we have been led to believe that the future is going to be defined by technology. Ergo, if you're going to talk about the future, then you have to be talking about technology. And the technology is going to be a very significant part of the future, but it's not going to determine what we do and what happens. And I think it's been fetishized, a lot. And I wonder if this is also why I think a lot of people think, futures, it's just people talking rubbish. And a lot of us do talk rubbish. But I think maybe the reason that there's been a bit of traction for me within shipping and maritime is because I don't have this attitude, which is, well, technology is going to determine everything. And if you're not adopting technology, then, you're a dinosaur and you might as well, naff off. Because that isn't what I believe. And it's not the way I've ever approached anything. And it's interesting, in the last few years, this real focus now on, and we'll talk about ESG, no doubt, but, this focus on, the societal impact of what we do, as businesses, the increasing importance of culture within organizations, talking about purpose-led business. These are things, when the big digital transformation gold rush started, sort of maybe 10 years ago, these were the things that I was saying, digital is not enough. It can enable an advantage, but it's not the advantage in itself. And it does seem now that people are beginning to realize that. And that's probably partly because there's been a whole heck of a lot of money thrown at digital transformation, which has failed miserably, because what it didn't do was address the underlying cultural problems, which were actually the issue.
Maybe we should set the scene start by talking about the global trade. What do you think about that? I mean, do you think it's changing? Do we see new patterns? Is this nearshoring something that we should pay attention to?
Yeah, I mean, let's say global trade, let's broaden that. Let's say global business, because I think that might be a more useful way to look at it. I think we're all aware that understanding what's coming next has become increasingly difficult. We are seeing some basic foundational certainties that really people have taken for granted for at least 50, maybe 70 odd years, all beginning to unravel in many people's view. And whether we're looking at, conflict in Europe, whether we're looking at environmental degradation, stagnant growth, these are all things that people have not really planned for. I think, there's been this attitude that, things will change, plus or minus, a couple of percent, but, really big things are not going to happen. I mean, we had the whole end of history thing, didn't we, a while back, in the 90s. And I think people kind of swallowed that and believed that. But when we talk about global business, I think there are some really profound things that are changing now that have been in place not just for 50 or 100 years, but for probably 500 years. Because the first wave of globalization during the sort of Renaissance, the beginning of the age of exploration, the age of discovery, colonialism, all these other things, we are literally going back centuries. And really all that comes down to something very simple, which is the obligation of a business is to make money. The purpose of a business is to make money. And anyone who's seen me speak knows I often talk about the Commenda, which were the first limited liability partnerships that were created during the Renaissance by ship owners, by sea captains and cargo owners to limit their liability. And from that, corporate law, double entry bookkeeping, insurance, all these things kind of flowed from that. So shipping was right at the beginning of all of this. And what you're actually seeing now is that primary responsibility is beginning to change. Because for the first time, we are now looking at businesses and saying, well, sure, you're making money, but how are you making that money? And are the externalities that you cause in your pursuit of that profit actually worth the profit that you're making? We're going to start judging you by different criteria. And that is absolutely new. That really isn't something we've done before. These non-financial metrics that we're talking about. And, certainly in the last 50 odd years, we've had this belief that the market is God, basically, market fundamentalism, as it's been called, everything can be reduced to a cost. And if we just leave the market to get on with things, then it will be fine. And unfortunately, climate change is probably the greatest market failure in history. And what we're beginning to understand is that there were always things that couldn't be dealt with by markets. But I think the other part that's really interesting to me is, I mentioned that, the market is God. And actually, we have almost treated the current economic paradigm as, a bit of a religion. And it's very much displaced a lot of other cultural norms, whether that be religious, all sorts of things. And what I see now is a swing back. I see that we are entering a new moral age. You can see it all over the world. And people are saying, no, we are not prepared to have, market-based economics as being the most important thing that, we all bow down to. And you start to see this splintering. And I think, the idea that there is no alternative has been fed us for a long time. And I know when people look at things like the election of former President Trump and they look at Brexit and all sorts of things, and they say, well, this is people, just reacting because they're angry because they haven't got anything, and this is a protest vote. And actually, I see it a slightly different way. I see it that this is somebody, or, this is an idea that there is an alternative. And I think the problem is that we've been told for a very long time that there's no alternative. And people get to the point where they can't really cope with that. And this comes to the heart of what I think, maybe the role of a futurist should be, because the most important relationship that we have as humans is with the future. It is literally the thing that marks us out from every other species on the planet. We are the only species that can not only conceive of multiple different futures, but we can discuss them in enough detail with each other to actually decide which one we like. And what we've done over the last 50 years is increasingly reduce people's opportunity to discuss those different futures. And that is fundamentally wrong. And I think the reaction, this new moral age, is it any longer acceptable for a company to make profit at the expense of the environment, or if they are not showing equity amongst all different kinds of employee, or are they paying their taxes, all these kind of things. I think this is a reflection of this new moral age, that people are beginning to say, well, you've told us there's no alternative to this economically based world that we live in, but actually we can still have values, we can still have cultural values and moral values. And that's where these culture wars are beginning to emerge, because I'm not sure it's so much about identity, it's about eligibility. What are you allowed to do? What are you eligible to do, as a certain type of individual in the world? So all that comes together, I think, for business in a very interesting set of ways, because what business has really been told to focus down on, double down on, is you've got to adopt technology. It's about growth, it's about automation, technology, all this kind of stuff. And all of those things are beginning to stutter. And at the same time, you have these changing expectations amongst stakeholders. And it's very important to remember, when we talk about changing stakeholder expectations, they're not changing uniformly. Now, if you are, running a little corner shop somewhere, and your customers are all within a mile radius, so that, this might not be too much of a problem initially for you. But if you're running a multinational organization, this is really tough, because your stakeholders are going to be probably geographically very diverse. They're going to be culturally diverse. And in the old days, it was okay because everybody just wanted to make money. And there's an awful lot that you can sort of, draw a veil over, as long as everybody focuses on the fact that, well, maybe that's not so pleasant, but it's okay because we're making money. And suddenly we're saying that's not good enough. So you might have a set of stakeholders, particularly if you are in North America, or if you're in Europe, you might have sets of stakeholders that have expectations around environmental and, equality, all these kind of things that you're simply not going to find in other parts of the world. So how do you balance that? So, I think that this new moral age, I think it's moving us from the idea of globalization that has sort of driven businesses for so long to something new, which I call nobilization. It's now about how good a company are you? Do you behave in such a way that it is acceptable to customers, wider stakeholders, regulators, etc.? And as I say, that's really never happened before. And for shipping, which of course is, the archetypal global industry, this is going to get really, really difficult, because we're going to have to make choices. You're going to have to make, as organizations, you're going to have to start making some really difficult choices about where you stand on issues that you have never had to take a stand on before.
Wow, what a reply. Yeah, you made me thinking again. Changed my mind of, different things. To reframe the future. Because there is an alternative, you say.
Yeah, and I think that's where it gets interesting, because it's easy to throw rocks at, the current paradigm that we live in. But now things are beginning to stutter. It's not enough just to say we don't like this and we don't like that. You actually have to come up with an alternative. And I think, to do that, where you start is understanding, the problem here. And it's, we've had a pandemic. We're still, experiencing a pandemic.
I know.
Yeah, I was going to say, full well how strongly we're still experiencing a pandemic. But I think that's a useful way to understand what's going on, because we've had a pandemic, an epidemic, but what we actually have is a series of epidemics going on right now. And they are all happening at the same time. They're all interdependent, they're reinforcing each other, and they're very complex and they're emergent. It's this synergy of epidemics, which I call the global syndemic, and they're across several key areas. We've got a health epidemic, we've got a technology epidemic, we've got an economic epidemic, and we've got an ecological epidemic. And all of these things are moving together, and they are creating massive, massive problems for us. And the root causes of these are similar in actual fact. They're in this current paradigm, what we value and what we don't value. And I think if we can start tackling the root causes of that global syndemic, then we will start to unlock some solutions. But in order to do that, you have to drive really profound systemic change. And of course, this is happening just at the point where a lot of the global consensus that we've had for many years, or the perceived global consensus anyway, is beginning to break down. So we've kind of got a bit of a perfect storm. But it's also, a massive opportunity, because you have a lot of people for a lot of years saying that this kind of thing isn't sustainable. The way the world works is not sustainable. But it's not until things start falling apart that you're actually going to get traction. And things are beginning, to really struggle now. And that's the point at which, you need to be ready with some answers. And I think there are answers to this. I think the key question for businesses to ask themselves is, how am I going to create value in the future? And that comes down to a recalibration, because what we've really done as a global society is we've understood the cost of everything and the value of nothing. And we really do need to recalibrate. It's how we've got to the position where Amazon, the company, is worth trillions of dollars. And yet the Amazon, the most important ecosystem on the planet, is worth absolutely nothing until it's burnt, chopped down and sold. There are fundamental problems here in the way we approach what we value. And actually that framing of value goes all the way back hundreds of years as well. We've just reinforced. What do we measure? We measure GDP. Well, GDP is meaningless. That was just a post-Second World War consensus that measures what governments and businesses do and leaves out massive swathes of the economy. It doesn't measure anything, really useful. I think in Australia, they worked out that if you actually measured domestic, chores and looking after people, all that kind of stuff, it's the second largest part of the economy, more important than financial services. But we don't measure that. And the reason they didn't measure that after the Second World War was they said it was too difficult. We can't collect those kind of metrics. So you see, when I talk about opportunities, a lot of the reasons that we haven't collected things, we haven't looked at certain things, is we believed it was too complex, it was too difficult. But we are in a position now with this massive, data gathering apparatus that we have to actually gather some really meaningful, useful statistics that could inform us about how we can change the world. But that takes a collective will to say, no, we're not just going to concentrate on these figures. And this is beginning to happen. You're seeing, the global happiness index, all sorts of other metrics that have not really been considered important. They're becoming important, and this feeds into the whole ESG thing. We're starting to actually look at non-financial metrics. So, what do we do? Well, the new value nexus, I think, certainly from a business perspective, is the green economy, the blue economy, and the circular economy. Because a 1.5 degree world is a circular world. That's basically what it comes down to. And I'm consistently astonished at the lack of understanding and the lack of knowledge within businesses about the circular economy, because it is a multi-trillion-dollar business opportunity. But inherent in circularity is demand reduction, and that's, I think, the bit that people have trouble with. Because when you are a business and everything you do is predicated on growth, the idea that you're going to adopt, a system which is based on low to no growth, that is a real problem, because that undermines pretty much everyone's worldview. But that's the way that we have to go. What we have right now is a whole generation of business leaders who've never really had to manage serious adversity. And you go back to the early 70s, things were in big trouble. That generation of leaders is gone. And we are facing massive headwinds as businesses. And it is the time to shift that worldview, because what we're doing right now is it's just not sustainable. And I think there's a positive about this. Increasingly, the chief executives that I speak to in businesses around the world, they get it. They really do get it. But it is a massive uphill struggle to change it. And that's why you need ecosystems to do it. A sustainable transformation, as I describe it, that is not, a zero-sum game. It's not something you can win at. It's a team sport. And that takes a very different attitude, a very different kind of leader than we're used to identifying and promoting.
So I am correct in looking for the new reality, because I haven't found it. We spent 2 years during the pandemic to discuss it. What will happen now? How will everything be different and all of that? And I don't see anything different. I see same old, same old. Give me some hope, Kate.
There are changes. there are changes. The thing is that they're not very evenly distributed. And also, you know, it's a bit like the whole iceberg analogy. There's all sorts of things happening below the surface that not everyone is aware of. And I'm talking specifically here about shipping and maritime organizations. During the height of the pandemic, it was very interesting that the talk was all about digitization is being accelerated, when what was actually happening was that cultural change was being accelerated. That's what actually happened, because people started talking about where people worked and how they worked. And yes, digital might have been an enabler of that, but it brought up all these kind of cultural questions. How do we work together? You know, who should be reporting to who? How overworked are people? You know, what should we expect of people? You know, and that coincided and has coincided with the great resignation, you know, that's been going on globally. But I mean, if you look at some of the stats of the rate of resignation in the United States over the last year, I mean, it's just eye-watering. It's incredible. So I think things did shift, but I completely sympathize with you when you say, you know, we're not seeing anything. But change of the magnitude that's needed is not going to be obvious overnight. And I think as a futurist, I often talk about the past, you know, which, you know, may sound a bit weird, but I think what tends to happen is that you don't really understand the extent to which things changed until you look back a couple of years later. And I always advocate for companies who are going through, you know, transformations and things, and they get really sick and tired and they go, you know, we're just working really hard and we're not achieving anything. And I always say to them, you know what you really ought to do. And this is based on a bank that I was working with many years ago. And their chief exec said, you know, we're just really tired with all this transformation stuff. And then they had a couple of really long-serving employees who had just retired and they'd been gone for 6 months. And they came back and sort of had a lunch and met a few people. And they just walked around going, oh, wow, you know, so much has changed and you've improved this and that's different. And the CEO said, you know, it was exactly what we needed because we were so close to it. We couldn't really see how much we'd done. And the thing is, this is a long journey and you've got to look for, for waypoints, got to look for milestones, things that are changing. And I think, you know, we say what's changed, but I mean, just look at the Poseidon principles. I mean, you go back 10 years. I mean, you would not really have anticipated that something like that would be able to happen. I think also when we're talking about now ESG and reporting and all these kind of things. I mean, go back again to when RightShip, you know, started up, when, you know, Warwick's, you know, gang got that off the ground. I mean, there were ship owners who were saying, you know, we're going to boycott, you know, we're going to sell all our ships, you know, we're not playing. If you want to, you know, take this kind of data, then we're just going to take our toys and go and play somewhere else. And yet now that's pretty much unthinkable that, you know, reputable ship owners and ship managers, you know, would have that attitude at all. But I think, you know, it comes back to my original point that expectations from stakeholders are not changing uniformly. And I'm always fascinated to look at the, you know, the chatter that comes out after, you know, big exhibitions or conferences and things, not just in shipping, in all sorts of industries. And it's so fascinating. There's all these people talking about sustainability. There's people, you know, with, you know, Ukraine flags in their, you know, their bios and, you know, hashtag, you know, we're for Ukraine or this kind of thing. And yet they've all just come back from Posidonia and they're all saying, aren't these ship owners wonderful? And the ship owners are all saying, these sanctions are absolutely rubbish. And, you know, if there are cargoes to be carried, you know, we'll carry them. Now, I'm quite sure that, you know, these ship owners would say to you, well, look, you know, you can't just cut off part of the global economy. You know, there are people around the world suffering for this. But what it's coming down to is there are moral choices being made. And when I say stakeholder expectations are changing, if you have stakeholders with, you know, big consumer facing businesses, it's not just going to be, are you a net zero supply chain? It's going to be, are you corresponding with the ethical and moral values of our stakeholders? And that's a real problem because you mentioned nearshoring. Well, there's something else that people have been talking about, which is friendshoring, but I would go further. I call it moral shoring. Because what's actually happening now is it's not enough to say, what kind of emissions are we going to have down our supply chain? People are now saying, we are going to kick people out of our supply and value chains if they don't correspond with our stated values. And this is where it gets really super difficult, because it's exceptionally hard to say, well, there may not be an international consensus on what's happening in Ukraine. But if you're in Europe, certainly Northern Europe, the UK, where I speak to you from today, if I was to stand up and have any, suggestion that what has happened in Ukraine isn't really black and white and cut and dry, then people would be outraged. And yet, as shipping, we have people operating in jurisdictions all around the world, and you will see comments on, online from people in, different parts of the world saying, good for Russia. And this, how do you solve that? You don't. And the way that you end up solving it, as I say, is unfortunately this moral shoring. And there are a lot of people saying that this could be an absolute disaster for the global economy. Because if you start only doing business with people who share your moral or cultural values, then, that could cost trillions to the global economy. But we're entering a new moral age. So what do? Do you say I'm completely morally ambivalent? I don't take a stand on anything. Well, your employees aren't going to thank you for that. Some of your stakeholders will say, well, we're not going to support you if you don't take a stand on, ethical sourcing. When does ethical sourcing become about, who you employ and where you do business? That's what's happening now. It's bigger than sanctions. So I'm saying to you that I have a solution for this. But what I am saying is that when we look at shipping, we have to understand that there is not going to be, it's like a fuel. What's the fuel of the future? Everyone's going to use this. No, there's going to be a fragmentation, because certain organizations are going to say, you know what? We want to make money, and there's money to be made here. And frankly, if it doesn't correspond to, this agenda, this moral agenda in one part of the world, then fine, we'll sacrifice that, because we're going to go and service this market, which has a different moral and ethical framework than the one we're in at the moment. But the thing is, you're not going to be able to do it all. That's the key message here. It's not that, you should do this or you shouldn't do that. It is, you are going to have to make a choice about what you do. And again, shipping has never had to do that before, because, here it is. Here we are. We'll take a cargo, whatever you like, and sanctions, do sanctions work? Do they not work? There's a whole argument around that. But the point is, they're there. And if you choose, to ignore them, then it means you can't do certain amounts of business. So I guess this is what I'm trying to get across. Shipping is going to have to make choices in a way that it never has before. And the way that this becomes relevant to you saying, are we seeing changes? The number of leaders who are talking about purpose within an organization, this is kind of one of those woolly things, is, it's a bit like CSR, let's leave it to the HR people and the women, this is not really very important. It's soft stuff for reports and PR agencies. No, wrong, reset. Because when you have to make these choices, which are not business choices, they are not about how much money you can make. Because if it's about where do you make money, it's very simple. We know how to do that. We've got all sorts of ways to evaluate how best to make money. When you have to make a choice which is moral or ethical, suddenly you need some kind of purpose, because you need something to measure it against, which means companies have to start saying, this is our purpose, these are our values. And when it comes to these difficult choices, that gives you a framework within which you can make a legitimate choice. So that's why purpose is important.
Now that you're talking about it like that, I can see a few who has got this.
Yes.
And that is an opportunity for them.
It is. A lot of the, the CEOs, the boards, the senior leaders that I've had the privilege to work with within shipping and maritime, they recognize that they are being given an opportunity to operationalize not just their assets, but their values. And, we've talked about corporate values, it's how we do things. But now purpose is why we do things. It's almost the next iteration. And I'm sure, Lena, you've been in this business a long time. You've seen it as I do. There are, particularly in Asia, I find that there are a lot of businesses that are, really take their values seriously. They They talk about them all the time. And as I say, this is an opportunity, not just to have the values that you talk about, but to actually say, from a non-financial metric perspective, these are important. But more than that, they are going to drive the bottom line. But as I say, you have this balance, because sometimes you're going to have to make a difficult choice that says, maybe this isn't going to make us as much money as it could. Are we going to take, this contract that in 3 or 4 years' time may no longer be deemed, an appropriate cargo to carry? Or, these are really difficult choices. So I think that there is progress. I think that there is mindset change happens first. And that's what I'm seeing at a senior level, is a real understanding that things are shifting, and an appetite to understand how you deal with this. And we really, really need that. We really need that.
We also need the next generation.
Yeah.
And those people they have different values than the ones retiring now, I think.
Okay, I'm gonna qualify that. I think that this generation have come of age in a world where they haven't had the certainties that my generation, if you like, sort of had. And it is probably, if you come of age, you grow up in an environment where things are pretty tough a lot of the time, we're not sure about this. And the adults around you, are concerned about, what's happening. By definition, you're probably going to be a little bit more anxious than, you would have been otherwise. So I think, there's a natural anxiety in this generation. But I also would point to the fact that an awful lot of people in business, in industry, they wanted to change the world too, And I had an experience, and I've told this story many times, with a very large organization. I was doing a workshop with all their board and senior leaders. And I was saying, these Gen Ys, these Gen Zs, they're not going to put up with stuff, they're zero tolerance. They're not going to put up with stuff that they think is wrong. They want to change the world. And this guy who was the CFO at the time, he said, yeah, but listen, we all wanted to change the world. And I said, yeah, but the thing is, these guys seem to have the tools, they're of a moment. They're of a moment in history where they do seem to be actually in a position that they might be able to change things, but they're not going to do it on their own. I mean, this has to be a coalition. You can't just say it's up to the younger generation to change this. And my God, that makes me angry. The head of, Sundar Pichai saying, the head of Google, and he's saying, it's really, it's down to the younger generation to decide, how they deal with this technology that we've given them. Excuse me, Lena, I'm going to swear on your podcast, but bullshit, okay? No, you don't get to create this unbelievably powerful, unregulated technology and then say, well, it's down to the kids to work out how to make the best of it. No. And you see, this is the problem with technology, with this idea that, we just leave it to the kids. The kids are the future, because it allows you to abrogate responsibility. We'll just do all this and make all the money, and then we'll walk away and it'll be someone else's problem. It isn't, it's everybody's problem. And I think it's a bit pernicious, this idea that the younger generation can come and change everything. They are part of a coalition. And like that CFO that I just mentioned, who's now the CEO, by the way, it takes people like him. It takes Gen Zs. It takes people in all parts of the organization, of the world, of different age brackets. Because what we're talking about here is not something which is, just about, the distant future. I mean, the impacts are happening now. The idea that you can sort of say, we'll just introduce this stuff, and then these kids are all going to be wonderful, and they're going to step up to the plate, and they're going to solve all this. And by the way, they're going to solve it all with technology. Oh, come on. I mean, really, I think it's disgraceful. I think it's absolutely disgraceful that, as a world, we are heaping so much expectation on one generation, and a generation which is, kind of anxious about things as it is. So the idea that you can leave this as a business, I'll just leave this in the in tray, for my successor. Well, I think you should, shame on you. If that's the attitude you're taking, you hear this, and you're, I'm too old for all this. In my day, this, but it's okay because the young ones can take over now, and it's all this transgender stuff and everything. I don't know anything about that, and I'm just going to go off and do my gardening with my fat pension. Okay.
I love your passion, Kate. rarely get to see that, but I'm happy that you're still,
Well, you speak to these, these younger people, these younger generations, and they say the thing that makes them more angry than anything is when you call them digital natives. Oh, well, they're different because they grew up with digital. Oh, come on. I mean, really? No, they're different because they're zero tolerance. They're different because they're saying, you know what? It's not acceptable in global society for some people to have so much more than other people. It's not acceptable that if you don't conform to, a market-based stereotypical norm, you are disadvantaged. Not only does everyone matter, but everyone matters equally. That's what makes them different, not the fact that they're scrolling through Instagram all the bloody time. And it's very convenient, you see, it's very convenient for our generation to say, well, that's the problem. It's all about digital, it's about technology. No, it's not. These people are looking at the world and they're saying, this is unacceptable and it needs to be changed. It needs to be changed now. And our response to them is, there is no alternative. Our response to them is, you don't understand. And what we're discovering is they understand a lot better than we do, that things have to change. And that should give us enormous hope. But the thing is, we can't leave it to them. They need us, right?
Yeah.
Because we're still in the positions of influence and authority. It has to be a coalition.
I never expected to become an influencer my age. But it's only in my time, I think, it's possible to be that in my age.
No. I mean, I think what's so fascinating about these younger generations is they are absolutely blind to what you are or who you are. It is they are looking for authenticity. They are looking for people who have, ideas, passion, belief, motivation. They're looking for partners. They're very collegiate, they're very collaborative, the attitudes that are coming up in these other generations. They don't want someone to go out and do it on their own. They want to do it as a big group, but they need a collaboration with different people. And they're not scared of difference.
No.
You've done an awful lot with, raising the profile of, women within shipping and maritime. And, this is, diversity, equality, inclusion. This is incredibly important. But, an awful lot of it has been about people being scared. People are scared, women come in and things change because it's no longer a homogenous group of middle-aged men. And that can be scary for people. Any kind of change is scary. And that's what you're not seeing so much with these younger generations, that they actually quite like the idea that someone is different from them.
But there is no reason to be scared. It's the people who can see that there will be more and different instead of the females taking something away from them. It's not
exactly, and not or. Yeah, I mean that encapsulates it really. And what my generation have been encouraged to believe is, everything is zero-sum game. There are winners and there are losers. You either get this or you get that. And what these generations are beginning to say is no, and not or. There is room. Why shouldn't there be room? And this is why, as I say, I think the culture wars are coming back to, it's not so much about identity, it's about eligibility. Because in our world, we have said there's a very, very narrow range of people that are allowed to do certain things. You can only do this if you are this. And that doesn't really work because it disadvantages so many people. And as I say, what you're hearing from them is not only does everyone matter, but everyone matters equally. And that upends our systems that we've built over the last 100 years, certainly the last 70 years are very, very inflexible. And that's what you saw during the pandemic. Once you get a shock to the system, it just falls over because it can't cope. And now we've introduced all these algorithms which are using the past to predict the future because that's all they do. They're trained on historic data. And if that, historical data is not accurate or is biased, then all it does is it perpetuates these not fit for purpose systems. And that's happening now. And so many kids, younger people are saying, well, these systems aren't fit for purpose. We need to change them. But it takes all of us to change the system.
There is another buzzword, which is partnership. It's the new leadership. So if I go along with what you're saying, we're going to see these unexpected partnerships that I'm waiting for.
I think they're already taking shape, actually. Yes, partnership is the new leadership. I think we're moving from a leadership perspective, if we look at that specifically, and we've always had this command and control paradigm. And interestingly, we've introduced technology to reinforce those hierarchies, that command and control. And we've de-emphasized autonomy. What we've really said is organizations are like machines, and everybody has a little job. And as long as they do it properly, then the machine will hum smoothly. But what we need now is something very different. You need the ability to convene and to catalyze, not necessarily just to tell people what to do. And there have been leaders in the past who, within these hierarchies, still commanded respect and love, and people did things because, they loved working for them. So that's not to say that we haven't had great leaders, but ultimately their authority still rested on hierarchy. You did stuff because you were scared that if you didn't, you would get fired. I mean, that's actually, I know we shouldn't say this out loud, but that's why most people do stuff at work, because otherwise they're worried they're going to be fired. And what we're seeing with this great resignation is people turning around and saying, you know what, screw this, fire me, whatever, I'm going. I'm no longer going to do things that I don't find meaningful. And that creates a massive problem for leaders who are basically, there and rely on the hierarchy and the power to fire somebody in order to get them to do what they're told. And this isn't new. I mean, I think it was Eisenhower, wasn't it, who said, the secret of leadership is getting people to do what you want them to do because they want to do it. So, I mean, let's not pretend there's anything particularly revolutionary here. But when we look at the scale of change that needs to happen, it's ecosystem change, it's systemic change. And as I say, you can't do that alone. So, the gung-ho command and control, win at all costs, traditional CEO, they're not very good at that. They're not very good at bringing people around the table and actually leading by serving a greater purpose, if you like, than just making a profit. And let me be clear at this point that there are also structural impediments to this. What you really want is for ecosystems to come together and change things. But we have things like competition law. So the people you should probably be sitting down, convening, and catalyzing new thinking with are people that, you'll be up on charges if you're found to be colluding with. So we also need to understand that our regulatory and our, competition structures, all these other things, they are acting as an impediment now to the kind of systemic change that we actually need. So you can't heap it all onto leaders. But to go back to the leadership thing, as I say, most of us do stuff at work because we're scared. And we've got a generation now saying, well, you know what, I'm not even going to get a mortgage. I'm not going to take out a loan for a car. So if I don't have my job, then I lose my home and my car. I'm going to go a different way. And that really creates a huge headache. Why do you go to work if not? If it's not because you have to earn the money, why are you going to do this? Or if you're not concerned about earning big money, then why would you do this? I mean, selling Coca-Cola is not really a vocation. Being a surgeon is a vocation. Being a nurse, being a carer, being a teacher, these things are vocations. But what we've all been encouraged to do, this knowledge work, I mean, you really want to spend all your day on social media, blogging deodorant or toilet paper? Is that a vocation? Hey, we sold more toilet paper in the last 6 months than we did the 6 months before. What? Hey, let's go and get drunk. I mean, when you look at it in those terms, you can kind of understand why we need to change the way that companies operate. Now, you could argue, say, well, we sold all this toilet paper and you get a massive bonus. Okay. But again, what we're seeing with these generations is money is just not enough compensation. No money seems to be enough compensation.
We can go on. Let's make part 2. And I think maybe we should start talking a little bit more about the maritime and shipping world that we are both so passionate about.
Absolutely.
Kate, an entire episode, and we didn't even get to what it all means for the shipping and maritime industry. Our conversation went on and on, so I realized that I would have to cut it in 2. There is so much more to talk about. And maybe you want to listen to parts of this conversation again before we take on what it all means for the maritime industry. I was exhausted by doing this interview. My head has been spinning since then, and I get small aha moments all the time about the coming changes. Hang in there. You have 2 weeks to think about everything said in this episode. So, until the next Shipping Podcast Friday, from me to you, over and out. Thank you for listening to the Shipping Podcast. Don't forget to tell everyone that you meet that there is a shipping podcast available and that they should download it and listen to the maritime professionals who are sharing their passion for the shipping industry.